Hey, what is up, everyone? Today we got a pretty unique story. It's narrated by Frederick Surrey. Get cozy and watch till the end, guys.
There is a silence that comes before betrayal, not the comfortable quiet of a peaceful evening, or the reverent hush of a cathedral at prayer. It is a silence with weight to it, a heaviness that presses against your chest and makes you hold your breath without knowing why. It is the silence of the moment before a blade finds its mark, before the ground gives way beneath your feet, before the person you trusted most in all the world turns to face you with cold, unfamiliar eyes. Nathaniel Garro knew that silence. He lived in it for years without understanding what it meant. He breathed it in with every stale, recycled breath aboard the warships of the Death Guard. He felt it in the sidelong glances of his brothers, in the whispered conversations that stopped when he entered a room, in the way his Primarch studied him across the length of a table as if weighing the worth of a blade before deciding whether to keep it or cast it into the furnace. And when that silence finally broke, when the truth behind it came screaming into the light in fire and blood, and the death of everything he had ever believed in, Nathaniel Garro did something that no one expected, something that changed the course of human history across 1,000,000 worlds and 10,000 years. He chose loyalty, not to his legion, not to his Primarch, not to the brotherhood of warriors who had fought and bled beside him for decades of unrelenting war. He chose loyalty to the truth, to the Emperor, to the dream of what humanity could become if it refused to kneel before the darkness that was reaching for its throat. This is the story of that choice, of the man who made it, and of everything it cost him. Because Nathaniel Garro did not simply survive the greatest betrayal in human history, he became the instrument through which its consequences were shaped for the next 10,000 years. He was the messenger who carried the warning, the blade that Malcador the Sigillite drew from the fire, the architect of a secret weapon that would defend humanity against the horrors of the warp for millennia to come. He was the first knight-errant, the Agentia Primus, the hand of the Sigillite, and though his name has been lost to the passage of ages, scrubbed from records and buried beneath layers of imperial bureaucracy and deliberate concealment, the legacy he left behind stands to this day in the silver-armored warriors of the Grey Knights, the most secretive and most dedicated chapter of Space Marines ever to carry the Emperor's will into battle. So, settle in. Let the noise of the day fade into the background. Let the hum of the world around you become like the background rumble of a warship's engines, steady and constant and almost comforting. Because this story starts a long time ago, in a place that no longer exists, in a world that has been transformed beyond all recognition by the weight of 30,000 years of history. It starts on Terra, in the ruins of old Albia, where a boy with a warrior's blood in his veins looked up at the smoke-darkened sky and dreamed of something greater than the soot-blackened walls of his Castrum city. It starts with the Dusk Raiders. There is a part of Terra that we know almost nothing about, and yet it shaped one of the most important figures in the entire history of the Imperium. Old Albia. The name itself carries the faint echo of an older world, a world that existed long before the Emperor emerged from the shadows of human history to unite a fractured planet under a single banner. The scholars of later millennia would debate the precise location of Old Albia, but the general consensus, supported by references to ancient cultural figures and geographical landmarks, places it somewhere in what we would recognize as the British Isles, or at least a region overlapping with that ancient landmass. By the time of the Unification Wars, Old Albia was a realm of towering castrum cities, their walls blackened by centuries of industrial smoke. It was a nation of warlord clans, of Ironside soldiers who marched in steam-driven proto-dreadnoughts and fought with a stubborn, implacable ferocity that made them feared even among the other techno-barbarian states of pre-unification Terra. The Albians were not simply warriors. They were soldier scientists, a breed of people who combined technological ingenuity with an almost genetic predisposition toward relentless, grinding conflict. And they were proud, fiercely, defiantly proud. When the emperor came to Old Albia with his thunder warriors at his back and his vision of a united humanity burning in his eyes, he did not come with war. He came with words. Unarmed and dressed in white and crimson, the emperor walked into the parliament of the warlord clans and laid before them his vision of a reunited species, of tyrants overthrown and nightmares destroyed. And he offered them redemption for centuries of bloodshed and kinslaying. He offered them glory among the stars, and to the shock of many who had expected the Albians to fight to the last breath, as they had fought against every other conqueror who had ever dared approach their walls, the warlord clans accepted. They became among the most zealous supporters of the unification, lending their warriors, their technologies, and most importantly, their sons to the cause. Those sons, drawn from the cream of Albia's warrior bloodlines, became the raw material for something new, something that had never existed before in all of human history. They became Space Marines, the 14th Legion to be precise. Among the first legions raised by the Emperor to fight his Great Crusade, the warriors who would one day be known as the Death Guard drew the bulk of their gene recruits from the ancient clans of Old Albia. This was not merely a matter of convenience or proximity. The Emperor had specific reasons for choosing Albion stock for his 14th Legion. The warrior culture of Old Albia, with its emphasis on endurance, stubbornness, and an almost inhuman tolerance for hardship, produced gene recruits who were ideally suited to the role that the 14th Legion would fill in the Emperor's grand design. They were heavy infantry without equal. In defense, they were immovable, able to hold a position under the most withering fire and refused to give ground until their last warrior fell or their last round was spent. In attack, they advanced in relentless, grinding waves, overwhelming enemy positions through sheer attrition and close-range firepower. They did not rely on speed or deception. They did not depend on clever stratagems or psychological warfare, though they were certainly capable of both when the situation demanded. Their primary weapon was endurance. Their primary tactic was simple, brutal persistence. They would outlast you. They would wear you down. They would keep coming, hour after hour, day after day, until you broke or died or surrendered. In those early days, the 14th Legion had no primarch. None of the Space Marine legions did, not at first. The Emperor himself stood as their father figure, their ultimate commander, the source of the gene seed that gave them their superhuman abilities. And in the absence of a primarch, the 14th Legion developed its own culture, its own traditions, or its own identity. Their power armor was unpainted, the grey of raw ceramite, but their right arms and shoulders were colored a deep, glistening crimson. The red right hand of the Emperor's justice, they called it, a deliberate echo of the imagery that had once marked the bloody reach of the old Albion tyrants before their submission to imperial rule. They fought their first wars during the tail end of the unification campaigns and the opening battles of the Great Crusade, and they fought them in a way that their Ironside ancestors would have recognized and approved of. Major ground attacks were launched at twilight, when the shifting light confused enemy watches and gathering darkness covered advances across open ground. It was an ancient Albion tactic, adapted for the wars of the 31st Millennium, and it earned the 14th Legion a name that stuck: the Dusk Raiders. It was among these warriors, in this culture of stoic endurance and relentless determination, that Nathaniel Garro found his home. Born on Terra, in the very heart of Old Albia itself, Garro was among the earliest wave of recruits drawn from the warlord clans. He was shaped by the traditions of his homeland before the gene seed of the Emperor reshaped his body, and those traditions never left him. They became the bedrock of his character, the foundation upon which everything else was built. He was an Albion to his core, and being an Albion meant something very specific. It meant you kept your word. It meant you held your ground. It meant you did not bend, did not break, did not surrender, did not betray, no matter what forces were brought to bear against you. These qualities made Garro an exemplary warrior. In the brutal crucible of the Great Crusade's early campaigns, he distinguished himself through a combination of tactical competence and unwavering personal integrity that earned him rapid promotion through the Legion's ranks. He was given command of the 7th Great Company and, with it, the honorific title of Battle Captain, a tradition dating back to the Unification Wars when an officer of the 14th Legion had distinguished himself before the Emperor and been granted the title as a reward. Garro carried the title with quiet pride. He was not a boastful man, not a warrior who sought glory for its own sake. He was, in the words of those who served alongside him, steady, reliable, the kind of commander you wanted at your back when things went wrong, but because you knew he would still be there when the dust settled, still holding the line, still doing his duty, no matter how dire the circumstances. He was also, and this would prove to be a crucial detail, a Terran. In the early days of the Great Crusade, this distinction did not matter much. Most of the Legion's warriors were Terran-born, drawn from the same Albion bloodlines that had produced the original recruits. But that was about to change, because somewhere out in the vast darkness between the stars, on a toxic, fog-shrouded world called Barbarous, something was waiting for them, or rather, someone. The discovery of a Primarch was always a momentous event. Each one of these 20 demigods had been scattered across the galaxy by the mysterious forces of the Warp, flung from the Emperor's laboratory on Terra as infants and deposited on distant worlds where they grew to maturity among alien cultures and hostile environments. When the Emperor's Great Crusade brought him to the world where a Primarch had landed, the reunion was typically an event of tremendous significance, a homecoming of sorts for a being who had spent his entire life unknowingly waiting for this moment. Mortarian's discovery was no different, and yet it set in motion a chain of consequences that would ultimately damn his entire legion and reshape the fate of the Imperium. Barbarous was a death world in every sense of the term. Its surface was perpetually shrouded in toxic mists and poisonous fog banks that rendered the lowland valleys all but uninhabitable. The higher elevations, where the air was marginally less lethal, were ruled by a caste of cruel, inhuman overlords. Alien beings, or perhaps mutated humans, the records are unclear. These overlords treated the scattered human settlements in the valley floors as livestock, raiding them for slaves and subjects for their dark experiments with impunity. The humans of Barbarous lived in perpetual fear, huddled in their mountain settlements, praying that the fog would not bring the overlords to their doors. Into this nightmare, Mortarion had been deposited. And like all Primarchs, he was shaped by his environment. Where other Primarchs might have been raised by kind foster parents or surrounded by a civilization that nurtured their development, Mortarion was forged by suffering. He was found by the most powerful of the overlords, a creature named Nathaniel, who saw in the infant Primarch a potential weapon and raised him in the poisonous heights of Barbarous, where no normal human could survive. But Mortarion's superhuman constitution allowed him to endure what would have killed any lesser being, and as he grew, he began to turn against his adoptive father. Mortarion escaped Nakara's fortress and descended into the valleys where the humans lived. He organized them, trained them, armed them, and led them in a campaign of rebellion against the overlords. Village by village, stronghold by stronghold, Mortarion liberated his people from the tyranny that had oppressed them for generations. He was a grim, relentless figure even then, gaunt and pallid from his years in the poisonous upper atmosphere. But his people loved him with a fierce devotion because he had given them something they had never possessed before: hope. The Emperor arrived on Barbarous at the climax of Mortarion's campaign against the overlords. Mortarion had sworn to defeat Nakar himself, to climb to the very summit of the highest peak and destroy the most powerful of the overlords in single combat. But the toxic atmosphere grew thicker and more lethal with every step he climbed, and even Mortarion's legendary constitution had its limits. He collapsed within sight of Nakara's fortress, choking on fumes that would have dissolved the lungs of any normal human in seconds. And then the Emperor appeared. Where Mortarion had failed, the Emperor succeeded, ascending the final distance and destroying Nakar with his own hands. When Mortarion recovered, he found the task he had dedicated his entire life to already accomplished by a stranger who claimed to be his father. The resentment born in that moment would smolder for decades. When the Emperor offered Mortarion command of the 14th Legion, the Primarch accepted. He had little choice in the matter, and despite his private bitterness over the circumstances of their meeting, he recognized the opportunity that was being presented. He renamed the Dusk Raiders the Death Guard, adopted new heraldry and colors that reflected the bleak aesthetic of his homeworld, and began to reshape the Legion in his own image. And this is where things became complicated for Nathaniel Garro. Mortarion began recruiting heavily from Barbarous, filling the ranks of the Death Guard with warriors drawn from the hardy, toxin-resistant population of his homeworld. And these new recruits brought with them the culture and traditions of Barbarous, which were markedly different from the Albion heritage that had shaped the Legion in its founding years. Slowly, steadily, the character of the Death Guard began to shift. The old Terran ways, the traditions of the Dusk Raiders, began to be overshadowed by the new Barbaran culture that Mortarion favored. For Garro, this was a source of quiet, persistent discomfort. He did not rebel against the changes. He did not speak out against his Primarch's decisions. He adapted, as a good soldier does, and he served the Death Guard with the same steady, unwavering dedication that had always defined his character. But he held fast to the old traditions in small, stubborn ways. He maintained the use of a housecarl, a personal attendant named Caleb Arryn. As in the old Albion tradition, he carried the title of Battle Captain with the same pride that the officers of the Dusk Raiders had carried it during the Unification Wars. And he was aware, always, of the growing distance between himself and his brothers. By the last decades of the Great Crusade, Garro was one of the few remaining Terran-born Astartes in the Death Guard. The original warriors of Old Albia had been gradually replaced, their numbers dwindling through attrition and the simple passage of time, until Garro and a handful of others stood as the last living links to the Legion's founding heritage. His fellow captains, most of them Barbaran-born, sometimes called him Straight Arrow Garro, a nickname that was equal parts grudging respect and gentle mockery. Garro was the traditionalist, the old guard, the warrior who clung to the ways of a past that most of the Legion had moved on from. Mortarion noticed. Of course he did. Primarchs noticed everything, and Mortarion was a careful, calculating figure who paid close attention to the loyalties and inclinations of his officers. In the closing days of the Great Crusade, during a campaign against a race of psychically powerful Xenos, Garro served alongside a detachment of the Sisters of Silence, the Emperor's elite pariah warriors. His performance was exceptional enough to draw the attention of Malcador the Sigillite, the Emperor's most trusted advisor and the Imperial Regent of Terra. After the campaign, Mortarion honored Garro with a private audience, sharing one of the Death Guard's traditional cups of vengeance, a drink composed of various toxic substances that the Legion's legendary constitution could survive, but which would kill any normal human in seconds. It was a mark of respect, a ritual that Mortarion reserved for officers he particularly valued. But there was something else behind the ritual, something calculating. Mortarion was testing Garro, probing his loyalties, trying to determine where this last stubborn son of old Albia truly stood. Because Mortarion was making plans, dark plans, plans that would require every warrior in the Death Guard to follow him without question into a darkness from which there could be no return. Garro drank the poison. He survived, as all Death Guard did, and he walked away from the audience none the wiser about what his Primarch was contemplating. But the silence was growing heavier. The feeling of something wrong, something fundamental shifting beneath the surface of the Imperium, was becoming impossible to ignore. And Garro, for all his steadiness, for all his loyalty and his stubborn adherence to the old Albion values that had shaped him, was about to discover that everything he believed in, everything he had fought for, everything he had given his life to serve, was built on a foundation that was about to crack and shatter and collapse into an abyss that would swallow half the galaxy. The Great Crusade was ending, and the Horus Heresy was about to begin. But let us linger here for a moment, in these last quiet days before the galaxy came apart at the seams. Because there is a campaign that happened just before Istvan that tells us something important about who Nathaniel Garro was, and what kind of warrior he had become after all those decades of service. The Death Guard were deployed against a Xenos race known as the Jorgal, strange alien beings who inhabited enormous bottle ships, sealed biosystems that drifted through the void like glass bubbles on a dark ocean. The Jorgal were not a major threat to the Imperium. They were a curiosity, an obstacle, an inconvenience that needed to be cleared from the path of the Great Crusade. But for the warriors tasked with their elimination, the campaign was a real and present danger, because the Jorgal fought from within the confines of their bottle ships, and boarding actions against an entrenched alien foe in unfamiliar, enclosed terrain are among the most dangerous operations a Space Marine can undertake. Garro led a portion of the assault, when his 7th Great Company breached the hull of one of the larger bottle ships and fought their way through a labyrinth of organic corridors and bioluminescent chambers, cutting down Jorgal defenders with the methodical efficiency that was the Death Guard's hallmark. It was during this boarding action that something unusual happened. Garro encountered a Jorgal psyker, a creature whose mental abilities far exceeded the crude physical resistance that the rest of the species offered. The alien psyker projected visions into Garro's mind, not attacks exactly, but images, feelings, premonitions, dark portents of a future that Garro could not yet understand. He saw fire and betrayal, brothers turning against brothers, the galaxy drowning in blood. The visions were fragmentary and confused, yet the psychic equivalent of shouting a warning in a language that the listener barely comprehends. But they left their mark. In the back of Garro's mind, a seed of unease was planted, a formless sense that something terrible was approaching that no amount of military preparation could prevent. He shook it off, as warriors do. He completed his mission, secured the bottle ship, and reported the encounter as a minor tactical footnote. The campaign was a success. The Death Guard moved on to their next assignment, and the psychic premonitions faded into the background noise of a life defined by constant warfare. But Garro did not forget. He filed the experience away in the part of his memory reserved for things that did not fit neatly into the structured, rational worldview that the imperial truth demanded. And when the truth of Istvan was finally revealed, when the visions of fire and betrayal proved to be not the delusions of an alien mind, but an accurate forecast of the future, Garro would remember the Jorgal psyker and wonder if the universe had been trying to warn him all along. The Jorgal campaign was also notable for another reason. It brought Garro into contact with a detachment of the Sisters of Silence, the Anathema Psychana, the Emperor's elite pariah warriors whose very presence was toxic to psychic beings. The Sisters of Silence were not Space Marines. They were human women, recruited for their rare genetic trait of being soulless, psychic blanks who existed as voids in the warp. Their presence dampened psychic activity in their vicinity, is making them invaluable as guardians against psychic threats and as countermeasures against enemy sorcerers. Garro's interaction with the sisters was professional and respectful. He recognized them as fellow servants of the Emperor, comrades in the great work of the Crusade, even though their nature made many Space Marines uncomfortable. The sisters communicated through hand signs, having sworn an oath of silence that gave their order its name, and Garro learned to read their gestures with the same attention he gave to any other form of military communication. This encounter, apparently minor, was noticed by Malcador, the Sigillite. The Sigillite was constantly evaluating potential agents, looking for warriors whose character and capabilities might serve his long-term plans. Garro's ease in working with the Sisters of Silence, his lack of the superstitious unease that many Astartes displayed around pariahs, was noted and filed away. It was one more data point in the profile that Malcador was building. One more piece of evidence that Nathaniel Garro was the kind of warrior who could look beyond the narrow confines of his own legion and see the wider picture. Let me also tell you more about what those days aboard the damaged Eisenstein were really like, because the journey itself was a crucible that transformed everyone who survived it. After the escape from Istvan, and before the encounter with the Plague Marines, there were hours, perhaps days, where the Eisenstein simply drifted. The ship's crew, a mix of Death Guard Space Marines, human naval personnel, and the handful of refugees from the Vengeful Spirit, existed in a state of suspended crisis. The immediate danger of the traitor fleet was behind them, but the warp journey ahead was fraught with uncertainty. The ship's navigator was struggling with the damaged Geller field, trying to chart a course through the Imperium, while the barriers between real space and the warp flickered and wavered like a candle in a draught. During this period, Garro moved through the ship like a restless spirit. He checked on his wounded warriors. He spoke with Shipmaster Barik Karya, a veteran naval officer whose body was more augmetic than flesh after a plasma gun malfunction years earlier, and who was proving to be an invaluable source of calm competence in the midst of chaos. He visited the mortal crew members, the ratings and technicians, and void-born men and women who had never expected to find themselves at the center of a galactic catastrophe. And he spoke to them with a directness and a respect that they had rarely encountered from a space marine. This was one of Garro's most remarkable qualities. He treated mortal humans as people, not as tools or resources or background noise. He remembered their names. He listened to their concerns. He acknowledged their fear without condescending to it. In the novels and audio dramas that tell his story, Garro's interactions with mortals are consistently characterized by a warmth and humanity that set him apart from the typical Space Marine archetype. His housecarl, Caleb Arryn, exemplified this relationship. Arryn was a mortal man, a Legion serf who served as Garro's personal attendant in the old Albion tradition. He was not a warrior in any meaningful sense. He could not fight beside Garro in battle, but could not share the burden of the superhuman conflicts that defined a Space Marine's existence. But he was loyal, he was devoted, and he was willing to give his life for the captain he served, which is exactly what he did during the battle against Grulgor and his traitors. Caleb Arryn's sacrifice, the death of a mortal man in service to a transhuman warrior, was a moment of profound emotional weight in Garro's story. It forced the battle captain to confront the human cost of the war he was fighting, to recognize that the betrayal of Horus was not just a conflict between demigods and their superhuman sons, but a catastrophe that reached down to the very lowest levels of imperial society and destroyed the lives of people who had no voice in the decisions that shaped their fates. Garro mourned Caleb Arryn. He carried the weight of that loss through the rest of his journey, adding it to the growing burden of grief and responsibility that was slowly reshaping him from a Legion warrior into something else entirely. Something broader, something deeper, something that could encompass not just the narrow focus of military duty, but the wider canvas of faith and purpose and meaning that the heresy was forcing every thinking being in the Imperium to confront. The other survivors of the Eisenstein each contributed their own threads to this complicated weave. Eacton Cruz, the old lunar wolf, was a warrior from a bygone era, a half-herd, as his brothers had nicknamed him, whose old-fashioned values and insistence on tradition made him seem like a relic even before the heresy. But those same qualities made him a natural ally for Garro, because Cruz understood, as few others did, what it meant to hold fast to principles when the world around you was abandoning them. Kirill Sinderman, the Iterator, was perhaps the most unexpected member of the group, an elderly mortal intellectual, a master of rhetoric and persuasion who had spent his career promoting the imperial truth on newly conquered worlds. Sinderman was as far from a warrior as it was possible to be. But the events of the heresy had shattered his comfortable certainties just as thoroughly as they had shattered Garro's. And in the ruins of his old beliefs, new growth was beginning. Sinderman, the great champion of the imperial truth, was slowly and reluctantly coming to the conclusion that the Emperor might indeed be divine, and that the supernatural phenomena he had witnessed aboard the Vengeful Spirit and the Eisenstein could not be explained by the rational framework he had spent his life promoting. This intellectual and spiritual ferment, occurring in the cramped, damaged confines of a fleeing warship while the warp howled against its failing shields, was a crucible in the truest sense of the word. The people who emerged from it were fundamentally different from the people who had entered. Garro was no longer simply a Death Guard captain. Keeler was no longer simply a young imagist. Cinderman was no longer simply an iterator. They had all been transformed by their shared experience into something new, something that the old Imperium had no category for, and the new Imperium had not yet learned to name. Yet to properly understand the scope of what Garro accomplished as Agentia Primus, you need to appreciate the sheer physical and logistical challenges involved in his mission. The galaxy during the Horus Heresy was not a place that facilitated easy travel. Warp storms, generated by the massive psychic upheaval of the conflict, made interstellar navigation extremely dangerous and unpredictable. The Ruin Storm, a vast psychic barrier created by the Wordbearer's dark rituals, had split the galaxy virtually in half, cutting off entire sectors from communication and reinforcement. And everywhere Garro travelled, the war was present. Traitor and loyalist forces clashing in engagements that could make any star system a death trap for an unwary traveller. Garro navigated all of this with a small, fast ship and a handful of trusted companions. He was not leading armies or commanding fleets. He was a single warrior moving through the spaces between the great forces of the heresy, slipping past blockades and evading patrols, using guile and speed where strength and numbers were not available. His journey to Calth, where the Ultramarines had been ambushed by the Wordbearers, required him to navigate through or around the Ruin Storm itself. The details of this passage are not fully recorded, but the fact that he accomplished it at all speaks to both his determination and his resourcefulness. The Ruin Storm was not merely a navigational hazard. It was a manifestation of chaos itself, a region of space where the laws of reality were in constant flux, and where the entities of the warp pressed close against the thin membrane, separating their domain from the material universe. When Garro recruited Garviel Loken from the ruins of Istvan III, the mission required him to return to a world that was essentially a graveyard. The surface of Istvan III had been scoured by virus bombs and firestorms, its cities reduced to ash and its population exterminated down to the last microorganism. The few survivors, space marines tough enough to endure the bombardment by finding shelter in hardened bunkers and underground facilities, had been fighting a guerrilla war against traitor forces for months, slowly being ground down by attrition and the psychological horror of their situation. Loken was found in the ruins, barely coherent, his mind fractured by the horrors he had witnessed and endured. The former captain of the Lunar Wolves, a warrior who had once been renowned for his eloquence and his thoughtful, philosophical approach to warfare, had been reduced to something barely more than an animal, surviving on instinct and rage in the toxic wasteland that Istvan had become. Garro's ability to reach Loken, not just physically but mentally and emotionally, was perhaps his greatest feat of recruitment. It required patience. It required empathy. It required the ability to look past the damaged exterior and see the warrior still trapped inside, still fighting, still clinging to the shattered remnants of his honor and his duty. Garro spoke to Loken, not as a commander issuing orders, but as a brother offering a hand to a fallen comrade. He reminded Loken of who he had been, of what he had stood for, of the duty that remained, even when everything else was gone. When Loken finally responded, when the light of recognition and purpose flickered back to life in his hollow eyes, it was a victory as significant as any battlefield triumph. Garro had not just recruited another warrior, he had saved a soul. The process of gathering the knights errant also took Garro to some of the most dangerous and unexpected corners of the war. His recruitment of the Nemean Reaver, a mysterious warrior of the Dark Brotherhood, required a clandestine meeting on Optera 4 in the Pale Stars, where Garro sent out a coded signal and waited to see who would answer. Blood Angels. Captain Seren and White Scar's warrior Nirun also answered the summons, But the meeting was interrupted by an Alpha Legion ambush. Even in the act of recruitment, even in supposedly secure locations, the Knights Errant could not escape the shadow of the war. And each of these missions added layers of experience and wisdom to Garro's character. He was learning constantly about the full breadth of the Imperium's diversity and the many different forms that loyalty and courage could take. He met warriors who defined their honor differently than he did, who fought for different reasons and held different beliefs, but who shared the fundamental conviction that the Emperor's cause was worth fighting for. This education broadened his perspective in ways that his years in the Death Guard never could have, transforming him from a Legion specialist into something approaching a true champion of humanity as a whole.
Now, I want to take a quick second here just to share my personal thoughts on Garro, because honestly, he might be my favorite character in the entire heresy. And the reason is simple: he's not the strongest, he's not a Primarch, he does not have some secret power or ancient weapon that makes him unstoppable. He's just a guy who decided he was not going to be compromised on what he believed in. And that stubbornness, that refusal to bend, ended up being the thing that saved everything. And I think that is why so many of us connect with him. In a setting full of demigods and galaxy-ending super weapons, the most important thing that happened was one regular captain saying, "No, this is wrong, and I'm going to do something about it." That hits different. But anyways, let's go back to the video.
During the Buried Dagger period, just before the Siege of Terra began in earnest, the Knights Errant were involved in one of the most chilling investigations of the entire heresy. Across Terra, Sisters of Silence began appearing in states of severe distress, babbling incoherently in violation of their sacred vows of silence. All of them had been recorded as dead, casualties of previous engagements during the heresy. Their reappearance was deeply troubling, suggesting that someone or something was manipulating the dead and the lost as weapons against the Imperium's defenders. Garro and his fellow Knights Errant investigated this mystery, following a trail that led them through the layers of Terra's vast, labyrinthine society. The Throne World was a planet unlike any other in the Imperium, a world so densely populated and so thoroughly built upon that its original geography was buried beneath millennia of construction. Cities rose upon the bones of older cities, which in turn rested upon the ruins of civilizations so ancient that their very names had been forgotten. Moving through this urban wilderness, Garro encountered the full spectrum of Terran life, from the powerful administrators who ran the Imperium's bureaucracy to the forgotten masses who existed in the deep warrens beneath the surface. The investigation revealed that the reappearing Sisters of Silence were part of a chaos plot to infiltrate Terra's defenses in advance of Horus's assault. The forces of the ruinous powers were reaching ahead of the War Master's fleet, planting seeds of corruption and chaos that would blossom when the siege began. The Knights Errant fought a series of brutal engagements against cultists and demonic manifestations, purging the corruption with fire and blade while the clock ticked steadily toward the final confrontation. This period was also when Garro discovered, quite accidentally, a secret that Malcador had been desperately trying to protect. While investigating what appeared to be suspicious shipments of military equipment, Garro and an Imperial scribe named Catano Talari followed a trail of diverted resources that led them to Titan, the moon of Saturn. What they found there was a fortress monastery under construction, being secretly built and supplied on a scale that suggested a legion-sized force was being raised without the knowledge or authorization of the conventional military hierarchy. Garro initially believed this to be a traitor plot. The secrecy, the scale of the operation, the diversion of Imperial resources, as all of it pointed to either corruption or conspiracy. He was prepared to expose the operation and destroy whatever threat it represented. But when he and Talari breached the facility's security, they found Malcador himself waiting for them. The Sigillite was furious, not at the discovery itself, but at the timing. His plans for Titan were not yet complete, and premature exposure could compromise everything he had been working toward. Talari, horrified by what she had learned about the eternal nature of the chaos threat and the secret army being raised to fight it, was deemed a security risk. Malcador ordered Garro to execute her. Garro refused. This moment deserves particular emphasis because it speaks to the very core of who Nathaniel Garro was. He was Malcador's most loyal agent. He had served the Sigillite faithfully through years of the most dangerous and demanding missions imaginable. He understood the importance of operational security and the ruthless necessities of war. But he would not kill an innocent woman simply because she had stumbled upon a secret she was not supposed to know. Malcador, to his credit, relented. Rather than forcing the issue, the Sigillite found an alternative solution, bringing Tallery into confidence and putting her to work, completing the fortress as curator Adepta Primus. It was a pragmatic resolution, but it also revealed something about the relationship between Garro and Malcador. The Agentia Primus was not a mindless tool. He was a moral agent, a warrior who served by choice rather than compulsion, and whose compliance had limits that even the most powerful figure in the Imperium after the Emperor himself could not override. This was not a weakness, it was a strength, and Malcador, who was nothing if not a shrewd judge of character, understood that. A weapon that could think and choose and refuse unjust orders was infinitely more valuable than one that simply obeyed. Garro's moral backbone was precisely the quality that made him suitable for the work he was doing, because the fight against chaos was not simply a military conflict, it was a moral one. And warriors who could not distinguish between necessary evil and unnecessary cruelty were warriors who had already taken the first step toward the corruption they claimed to oppose. Let us speak briefly about the significance of Libertas, Garro's power sword, because it is more than simply a weapon. In the lore of the Horus heresy, the names of weapons carry meaning, and the name Garro chose for his blade is perhaps the most telling detail about his character. Libertas, liberty, freedom. In an age of absolute obedience, in a culture that demanded submission to the chain of command above all other considerations, Garro named his weapon for the concept of freedom. Not the freedom of anarchy or selfishness, but the freedom of conscience. The freedom to choose right over wrong, duty over convenience, truth over comfortable lies. Every oath he swore was sworn on that blade. Every mission he undertook was carried out with that sword at his side. And when he stood before Mortarion, in the ruins of Marmak's bastion, facing the monstrous thing that his Primarch had become, yes, it was Libertas that drew the demon Primarch's blood, the sword called freedom, wielded by the warrior who chose loyalty. There is a poetry in that which transcends the brutal reality of the moment. Libertas was more than a weapon. It was a statement, a declaration that even in the grim darkness of a galaxy at war, even in an empire that demanded absolute submission, the individual conscience retained its right to choose. And that right, that tiny, fragile flame of moral autonomy, was worth more than any amount of military power or political authority. That is the lesson of Nathaniel Garro. Not the military campaigns, not the heroic last stands, not the galaxy-shaping consequences. The lesson is simpler and more profound than any of those things. You always have a choice. No matter how dark the circumstances, no matter how overwhelming the pressure, no matter how many voices are telling you to surrender, to conform, to abandon your principles for the sake of survival or convenience or loyalty to a cause that has lost its way, you always have a choice. Garro chose well, and the galaxy is still feeling the reverberations of that choice, 10,000 years after the warrior himself fell silent. There is also the matter of Mortarion himself and what kind of Primarch he was before the fall, because understanding Mortarion is essential to understanding what Garro lost. Mortarion was not a monster before the heresy. He was a flawed, complicated, deeply troubled figure, but he was also a liberator. The people of Barbarus worshipped him as a savior, and they were not wrong to do so. Yet he had descended from the poisonous heights where his adoptive father had kept him prisoner. He had organized the downtrodden humans of the valleys into a fighting force, and he had led them in a campaign of liberation against the overlords who had terrorized them for generations. Village by village, stronghold by stronghold, Mortarion had broken the chains of his people, and he had done it through personal courage and relentless determination. These were the same qualities that defined the Death Guard. The Legion was shaped in Mortarion's image, and his image was not simply one of death and disease and despair. It was an image of endurance, of stubborn refusal to be defeated, of the absolute conviction that no obstacle was too great, no enemy too powerful, no hardship too severe to be overcome through sheer force of will. As Garro admired these qualities in his Primarch, he did not love Mortarion the way that some Astartes loved their Gene fathers, with the blind, unquestioning devotion that could so easily be twisted into betrayal. But he respected the Death Lord. He recognized in Mortarion a kindred spirit, another son of hardship who had been forged by adversity into something unyielding. And when Mortarion occasionally showed favor to his Terran-born captain, when he acknowledged Garro's skill or honored him with the cups of vengeance, Garro felt a pride that went beyond simple military satisfaction. The tragedy of the Death Guard's fall is not simply that they became monsters. It is that they were once among the most admirable warriors in the Imperium. Their stoicism, their resilience, and their willingness to endure conditions that would break other legions, these were virtues that Garro carried with him long after the Legion itself was lost. When he stood on the walls of the Imperial Palace during the Siege of Terra, enduring conditions that would have driven lesser warriors to despair, he was drawing on the same wellspring of stubborn endurance that had made the Death Guard the fearsome force they once were. The difference was that Garro channeled those qualities toward a worthy cause, while the corrupted Death Guard had seen those same virtues twisted into the service of decay and entropy. Endurance without purpose becomes mere suffering. Resilience without direction becomes inertia. The Death Guard, under Nurgle's influence, became creatures who endured not because they chose to, but because they could not stop. Yet their legendary toughness transformed from a weapon of liberation into a curse of eternal, mindless persistence. Garro saw this distinction clearly, and it was one more source of the grief that accompanied him through the years of the heresy. Every time he encountered a plague marine, every time he faced a corrupted servant of his former legion, he was confronting a dark mirror of himself, a reflection of what he might have become if he had followed Mortarion into the embrace of the plague god. The corruption of the Death Guard was not just an external threat to be combated. It was a personal horror, a constant reminder of the abyss that had opened beneath his feet when his Primarch chose damnation. The relationship between Garro and Rogel Dawn also deserves more attention, because it illuminates an important aspect of Garro's character and the political complexities of the Loyalist war effort. When Garro arrived on Terra with his warning, his interaction with Dawn was not a simple matter of messenger and recipient. Dawn's initial response was fury and disbelief, and even after he accepted the truth of Garro's report, his relationship with the former Death Guard captain remained complicated. Garro was, after all, a member of a traitor legion. His Primarch had turned against the Emperor. His brothers were enemies of the Imperium. The fact that Garro himself had remained loyal did not erase the stain of his association, and there were those among the Loyalist hierarchy who viewed him with suspicion regardless of his actions. Dawn, to his credit, did not let this suspicion prevent him from utilizing Garro's skills, but the Primarch of the Imperial Fists was a pragmatist above all things, and his interactions with Garro were colored by a wariness that never fully dissipated. Dawn respected Garro's courage and loyalty, but he also kept him at arm's length, preferring to let Malcador handle the former Death Guard captain, rather than integrating him directly into the Imperial Fist's command structure. This dynamic created an interesting tension in Garro's story. He was a warrior without a legion, serving a cause that sometimes seemed to regard him as an inconvenience at best and a potential threat at worst. He had proven his loyalty through actions that should have placed his devotion beyond any doubt, and yet he was still treated as something other, something apart, and a man who existed in the gaps between the great institutions of the Imperium, rather than within any of them. It was this very quality that made him ideal for the knights errant. Garro's status as an outsider, as a warrior who belonged to no legion and served no primarch, gave him a perspective and a freedom of action that would have been impossible for anyone still bound by the conventional command hierarchy. He could move between legions without arousing the territorial instincts that made Space Marines so protective of their internal affairs. He could approach warriors from any background without the baggage of legion rivalry. He could serve Malcador's interests without the divided loyalties that would have complicated the work of any warrior who still owed allegiance to a primarch. In a galaxy being torn apart by loyalty misplaced and loyalty betrayed, Garro's unattached status was not a weakness. It was his greatest asset. When speaking of the Grey Knights and their founding, there is one detail that often gets overlooked, and it is a detail that connects directly back to Garro's influence on the new chapter, even though he was not among the 8 founders. The Grey Knights, upon their creation, adopted a practice that echoed Garro's own transformation from Legion warrior to Knight errant. Every Grey Knight, upon induction into the chapter, surrenders his original identity. His name, his history, his former Legion affiliation, all of it is erased and replaced with a new identity that exists solely in service to the Grey Knight's mission. This practice of identity erasure was first modeled by the 8 founders, who took new names drawn from the mythology of ancient Terra's titans: Janus, Epimetheus, Chiron, Koios, Ogun, Iapto, Jotun, and Satre. But the practice itself was pioneered by Garro and his knights-errant years before the Grey Knights existed as a formal institution. When Garro stripped away his Death Guard heraldry and donned the unmarked grey armor of the Sigillite service, he was performing an act of symbolic rebirth that would become the template for every Grey Knight who followed. He demonstrated that a warrior could leave behind the circumstances of his creation and define himself instead by the purpose he chose to serve. This is not a minor point. The Grey Knights' effectiveness as a force against chaos is directly linked to their freedom from the hereditary loyalties and rivalries that define the rest of the Adeptus Astartes. They are not sons of any primarch. They do not carry the gene seed of any of the original 20 legions. Their gene seed is derived from the Emperor's own genome, making them, in a very real sense, the Emperor's own warriors in a way that no other chapter can claim. And their practice of surrendering their original identities ensures that no old loyalty, no ancient grudge, no vestige of the past can interfere with their singular dedication to their mission. Garro was the prototype for this approach. He showed that it was possible to be a warrior without a legion, a knight without a lord, a servant of the Emperor who served through choice rather than genetic obligation. And the Grey Knights, consciously or not, built their entire organizational culture on the foundation that Garro had laid. But the gene seed of the Grey Knights is another detail worth exploring. Where other chapters carry the gene seed of their founding primarch, a genetic legacy that connects them to one of the 20 demigods created by the Emperor, the Grey Knights carry gene seed crafted directly from the Emperor's own genome. This means that every Grey Knight is, in a biological sense, a son of the Emperor himself, carrying the master of mankind's genetic material in his flesh, in a way that no other Space Marine can claim. The decision to use the Emperor's gene seed, rather than that of any primarch, was deliberate and significant. It ensured that the Grey Knights would not be subject to the genetic flaws and psychological predispositions that characterized the primarch-derived legions. It removed the possibility of the gene seed itself becoming a vector for corruption, as had happened with some of the traitor legions. And it created a psychic resonance between the Grey Knights and the Emperor that enhanced their already formidable mental defenses against the powers of the warp. When Titan returned to real space after the end of the heresy, time dilation effects caused by its sojourn in the warp meant that centuries had passed on the moon, while only years had elapsed in the material universe. The 8 founders, who had entered the warp as relatively young warriors, emerged as ancient veterans, bearing the accumulated wisdom and experience of centuries of training and preparation. They had used their time wisely, molding the thousands of recruits that Malcador had provided into a disciplined, formidable fighting force. What the Grey Knights were designated, Chapter 666, the number itself carrying symbolic weight in Imperial numerology. They were slipped into the records of the Second Founding, the great reorganization of the Space Marine legions that followed the end of the heresy, with a secrecy so complete that most of the Imperium would remain unaware of their existence for millennia. They answered only to the Inquisition, specifically to the Ordo Malleus, the branch of that secretive organization dedicated to combating the demonic. For 10,000 years, the Grey Knights have fought their war. Every demon banished, every incursion contained, every world saved from the horrors of the warp, is a vindication of Malcador's vision and Garro's sacrifice. Yet the chapter that began with 8 founders on a hidden moon now maintains a full complement of approximately 1,000 battle brothers, each one a weapon against the darkness that presses constantly against the boundaries of reality. They are the wall between humanity and damnation. And the mortar that holds that wall together was mixed by the hands of Nathaniel Garro 10,000 years ago in the blood and fire and unshakable faith of a warrior from old Albia who refused to let the darkness win. The seeds of the Horus heresy were planted long before the first bolt was fired. They grew in the shadows of warrior lodges and in the whispered promises of entities that existed beyond the boundary of the material universe. They were nurtured by resentment and ambition, by jealousy and pride, but by the 1,000 small wounds that even demigods accumulate over centuries of warfare in service to a father who never quite told them the full truth of his plans. When Warmaster Horus Lupercal, the Emperor's most favored son, fell to the corruption of chaos on the moon of Davin, the stage was set for the greatest catastrophe in human history. But the tragedy of the heresy was not simply that Horus turned traitor. It was that he brought so many others with him. Primarchs who might have remained loyal were pulled into his orbit by grudges and ambitions and fears that chaos expertly manipulated. Legions that had served the Emperor with distinction for centuries were corrupted from within, their warrior lodges becoming breeding grounds for sedition, or their battle brothers turned against each other by loyalties that should never have been tested. Mortarion was among those who fell. The Primarch of the Death Guard had never loved the Emperor. The resentment born on the summit of Barbarus, where the Emperor had stolen his moment of ultimate triumph, had never truly healed. It had festered in the cold depths of Mortarion's heart, fed by the Emperor's policies on psychers which Mortarion despised with a passion that bordered on obsession, and by the general sense of being overlooked and undervalued that plagued many of the Primarchs in the latter days of the Crusade. When Horus made his pitch, Mortarion listened, and when the time came to choose sides, the Death Lord chose treason. But the betrayal could not be accomplished through a simple declaration of rebellion. But the traitor legions contained within their ranks thousands of warriors whose loyalty to the Emperor was absolute, who would never willingly follow their Primarchs into damnation. These loyalists had to be eliminated before the rebellion could begin in earnest, and Horus devised a plan of breathtaking cruelty to accomplish this: the Istvan system. On the surface, the situation appeared straightforward. The imperial commander of the Istvan system had renounced his oaths to the Emperor and declared independence. The Emperor ordered Horus to put down the rebellion by whatever means necessary. 4 legions were deployed to the Istvan system for this purpose: the sons of Horus, the Emperor's children, the World Eaters, and the Death Guard. But the planetary rebellion was merely a pretext. Horus had orchestrated the situation to create a killing ground where the loyalist elements within the 4 traitor legions could be eliminated in a single devastating blow. The plan was simple in its brutality. The loyalist warriors, those space marines whose devotion to the Emperor made them unreliable allies in the coming rebellion, would be sent to the surface of Istvan III to crush the planetary insurgency. Once they were committed to ground combat and unable to easily withdraw, the traitor fleet in orbit would unleash a virus bombardment, the most terrible weapon in the Imperial arsenal. The Life-Eater virus would destroy all organic matter on the planet's surface, and with it, every loyalist space marine who had been sent down to fight. Tens of thousands of space marines were marked for death. Us warriors who had served their legions and their emperor for decades, who had fought and bled across 100 worlds, who had trusted their primarchs and their battle brothers with their lives. They were sent to die, not in glorious battle against the enemies of humanity, but murdered by their own kindred in an act of betrayal so monstrous that it defied comprehension. Nathaniel Garro was not among those sent to the surface. In the weeks before the assault on Istvan III, Garro had been wounded during a preliminary engagement. The Death Guard and the Emperor's children had fought against rebel forces, holding an outer facility on one of Istvan's moons, and during the battle, Garro had encountered a warsinger, one of the rebel leaders who could create devastating sonic attacks through their singing. And the warsinger's powers had injured Garro severely, damaging his torso and one of his legs badly enough that the Legion's apothecaries could not declare him fit for frontline combat. Under normal circumstances, a wounded battle captain would simply be rotated to a support role until he recovered. But these were not normal circumstances. Garro's injury created a problem for the architects of the betrayal. He was too loyal to the Emperor to be trusted with knowledge of the coming treachery, but he could not be sent to the surface to be killed with the other loyalists, because his wounds made him unfit for the ground assault. The solution was grimly practical. Garro was assigned to joint command of the Death Guard frigate Eisenstein, alongside Captain Ignatius Grulgor, a warrior who had already pledged his allegiance to Horus. And Grulgor's true orders were simple. When the virus bombing began, and the loyalists on the surface were being exterminated, Grulgor and his detachment of traitor marines would kill Garro and his loyalist warriors aboard the Eisenstein, tidying up this last loose end. But the plotters had underestimated two things. They had underestimated Nathaniel Garro's loyalty, and they had underestimated the bond of friendship between Garro and Saul Tarvitz, a captain of the Emperor's children who had discovered the truth of Horus's plan. Tarvitz, upon learning that his own Primarch Fulgrim intended to have the loyalist Emperor's children annihilated on the planet's surface, made a desperate decision. He commandeered a Thunderhawk and flew to the surface to warn as many loyalists as he could, and giving them precious minutes to find shelter before the virus bombs fell. But before he made his descent, he contacted Garro aboard the Eisenstein and told him the truth. The betrayal, the virus bombing, the plan to murder every loyal space marine in 4 legions, everything. Try to imagine that moment. Try to place yourself in Garro's position. You are a warrior who has served your legion for decades. Your Primarch, the demigod who you were literally engineered to follow, has betrayed everything you believed in. Your brothers, the warriors who you have fought beside through 100 campaigns, are about to be murdered by the very people they trust most in the universe. And you are alone on a single frigate with a hostile captain and his detachment of traitors waiting for the order to kill you. What do you do? Nathaniel Garro did what an Albion does. He held his ground. He ordered the Eisenstein to fire on the traitor vessels pursuing Tarvitz's Thunderhawk, providing covering fire for his friend's desperate descent to the planet's surface. And then he turned to face the traitors in his midst. Grulgor and his warriors moved to carry out their orders, attempting to kill Garro and his loyal Death Guard. The resulting battle was fierce and close-quartered, fought in the corridors and compartments of the Eisenstein with the desperate intensity that only men fighting for their lives against former brothers can muster. Garro's housecarl, the loyal Caleb Arin, sacrificed his own life to ensure the Loyalists' victory. Grulgor and his traitors were killed, and many of them by exposure to the Life-Eater virus that had been secretly loaded aboard the Eisenstein, a horrific detail that underscored the depravity of the traitors' planning. With the ship under his control, Garro faced a choice that would define the rest of his existence. He could have tried to rally the scattered loyalists in the system. He could have attempted to fight back against the overwhelming traitor fleet. But Garro understood something that rage and grief might have obscured in a less disciplined mind. The survival of the Imperium depended not on fighting here, not on dying heroically in a battle he could never win, but on carrying the warning. Someone had to tell the Emperor what had happened. Someone had to reach Terra. And if Garro did not go, if this single, The damaged frigate with its crew of wounded loyalists and desperate refugees did not somehow cross the galaxy and deliver the message. Then Horus would strike at an Imperium that had no idea the blow was coming. Garro made his decision. The Eisenstein would run. Before the ship could escape, there were others to save. A Thunderhawk from Horus's flagship, the Vengeful Spirit, appeared on the Eisenstein's scanners. It carried a handful of desperate refugees who had escaped the slaughter aboard the War Master's own vessel, with the help of a lone loyalist Lunar Wolves captain named Iacton Cruz. Among the refugees were 3 individuals whose presence would prove significant in the years to come. Kirill Sinderman, a former iterator who would later play a crucial role in the establishment of the Imperial cult. Mercedes Ollerton, a remembrancer and documentarist. And Euphrati Keeler, a young imagist whose growing faith in the Emperor as a divine being would transform her into the first living saint of the nascent Imperial cult. Garro allowed them aboard. Every life saved was a victory against the darkness that was consuming everything he had known. With his crew assembled and his purpose clear, Garro prepared the Eisenstein for a warp jump. The preparations were hasty and desperate, conducted under the constant threat of discovery by the massive traitor fleet that surrounded them. But they had one advantage. The Eisenstein was just a frigate, a small vessel easily overlooked in the chaos of the unfolding betrayal. If they moved quickly enough, if their luck held for just a few more minutes, they could slip away before anyone realized what they were doing. Well, they almost made it. The Terminus Est, the massive flagship of Death Guard First Captain Callus Typhon, one of the key architects of the Legion's treachery, detected the Eisenstein's preparations and opened fire. Typhon knew what Garro was trying to do, and he was determined to prevent the warning from reaching Terra at any cost. The Eisenstein took terrible damage as it fled. Its warp engines were hit, and more critically, the ship's Geller field, the invisible barrier that protected a vessel from the malevolent entities of the warp during faster-than-light travel, was compromised. But Garro ordered the jump anyway. They had no choice. A slow death in real space under the guns of the traitor fleet, or a desperate gamble through the hell of the warp with a failing Geller field. Neither option was good, but one offered at least a chance of success. The Eisenstein plunged into the warp, and the nightmare began. The warp is not a place in any conventional sense of the word. It is the psychic reflection of the material universe, a dimension of pure emotion and thought where the laws of physics that govern normal reality simply do not apply. It is home to entities that feed on fear and pain and despair, creatures that would consume a human soul as casually as a man might swat a fly. Under normal circumstances, a starship's Geller field creates a bubble of real space around the vessel, keeping the horrors of the warp at bay. But the Eisenstein's Geller field was damaged, flickering and failing, and through the gaps in its protection, the dark powers of the warp began to seep in. The walls of the ship wept blood, and shadows moved independently of any light source, crawling across bulkheads and through corridors with predatory intent. The air grew thick and fetid, carrying the stench of decay and corruption that seemed to emanate from the very metal of the ship's hull. And then, the dead began to rise. Grolgor and his traitor marines, killed during the battle for the Eisenstein, had been stored in the ship's morgue. The power of Nurgle, the chaos god of disease and decay and entropy, reached through the weakened Geller field and found these corpses waiting. What emerged from the morgue was something that had never been seen before in the recorded history of the Imperium. Plague Marines. The first of their kind, animated by the foul power of the Dark God, their bodies bloated and diseased and filled with a terrible, unstoppable vitality. They were a preview of the horror that would eventually consume the entire Death Guard Legion, and they were loose aboard the Eisenstein. The fighting was desperate and close and brutal, beyond anything the Loyalists had yet endured. The Plague Marines were nearly impossible to kill, their corrupted bodies absorbing damage that would have destroyed a normal Space Marine 10 times over. Every wound they inflicted carried the taint of Nurgle's corruption, and the defenders found themselves fighting not just an enemy force, but a creeping, spreading infection that threatened to consume the entire ship. Garro fought with the calm, methodical determination that had always defined his combat style. Even in the face of horrors that would have broken lesser men, he held his ground. He directed his warriors, coordinated the defense, and personally engaged the reanimated Grulgor in a battle that tested every ounce of his transhuman strength and will. But the Plague Marines could not be defeated by conventional means. They kept coming, kept rising, kept spreading their corruption through the ship's corridors, no matter how many times they were cut down. It was Euphrati Keeler who provided the solution, though not through any military means. The young imagist, whose faith in the Emperor had been growing ever stronger since her experiences aboard the Vengeful Spirit, stood against the horror with nothing but her belief. And somehow, impossibly, her faith pushed the darkness back. The power of chaos recoiled from her conviction, and the Plague Marines were weakened enough for the Loyalists to drive them back. And it was the first recorded instance of the Emperor's power manifesting through human faith, a phenomenon that would grow to shape the entire future of the Imperium's relationship with the divine. Garro witnessed it, and it planted a seed of belief in his own heart that would grow and change him in the years to come. But even with the Plague Marines driven back, the Eisenstein was in desperate trouble. The ship had been savaged by the warp, its systems failing, its crew exhausted, its supplies dwindling. Garro ordered an emergency reversion to real space, tearing the ship out of the warp in a violent, uncontrolled translation that killed the ship's navigator and left the Eisenstein stranded in the void between stars. They were alive, they were free of the warp, but they were lost, with no way to navigate back to Terra and no means of calling for help. The silence that followed was almost worse than the fighting. In the quiet, damaged corridors of the Eisenstein, surrounded by the wounded and the dying, Garro stared into the darkness of space through the ship's observation ports and contemplated the real possibility that his warning would never reach Terra. That Horus would strike without warning, and everything would be lost. But Nathaniel Garro was an Albion, and Albions did not give up. He devised a plan born of equal parts desperation and brilliance. The Eisenstein's warp engines were too damaged to be repaired, but they could be jettisoned, and if they were detonated after separation, the resulting explosion would create a massive flare in both real space and the warp, a beacon, a signal fire in the darkness that any vessel within range would detect. It was a gamble. The explosion might attract enemies as easily as allies. There was no guarantee that any Loyalist vessel was within detection range, and the detonation of the warp engines so close to the Eisenstein could easily destroy the frigate as well, killing everyone aboard and rendering the entire desperate flight meaningless. Garro gave the order anyway. The warp engines were jettisoned and detonated, and the resulting explosion lit up the void like a second sun. And someone heard it. The Phalanx, the mobile fortress monastery of the Imperial Fists Legion, was in the region. Rogel Dawn, Primarch of the Imperial Fists and the Emperor's Praetorian, the warrior charged with the defense of Terra itself. It detected the Eisenstein signal and dispatched forces to investigate. The Imperial Fists found the battered frigate drifting in the void, its crew barely alive, its hull scarred by battle damage and warp corruption, but its cargo intact. The warning had arrived. When Garro stood before Rogel Dawn and told him what had happened at Istvan, the Primarch did not want to believe it, could not believe it. The idea that Horus, the Emperor's most beloved son, had turned traitor was inconceivable. The suggestion that 4 entire legions had rebelled against the Imperium was madness. Dawn's initial reaction was fury, not at Horus, but at Garro, for daring to speak such blasphemy against the War Master. But the evidence was undeniable. The damage to the Eisenstein, the testimony of the survivors, or the recordings and data that Garro had preserved throughout the desperate flight. Piece by piece, Rogel Dawn was forced to confront a truth that shattered something fundamental inside him. His brother had betrayed them all. When the full weight of that realization finally settled on Dawn's shoulders, he retreated to his quarters aboard the Phalanx. What happened there remains a matter of hushed speculation, Some accounts suggest that the Primarch of the Imperial Fists, one of the most disciplined and controlled beings in the Imperium, destroyed his own quarters in a fury of heartbroken rage. Others say he simply sat in silence for hours, staring at nothing, as the implications of Garro's warning unfolded in his mind. What is certain is that Rogel Dawn took action. Yet he sent a significant portion of his forces to the Istvan system to investigate and, if necessary, confront the traitors. He himself returned to Terra with the survivors of the Eisenstein to begin preparations for the defense of the throne world. And among those survivors, one warrior in particular was about to be given a new purpose. Nathaniel Garro had fulfilled his mission. He had carried the warning across the stars, through warp storms and chaos corruption, and the relentless pursuit of traitor forces. He had done what no one else could have done, and in doing so, he had potentially saved the entire Imperium from annihilation. But his story was far from over, because someone else had noticed Nathaniel Garro. Someone who had been watching him for a very long time, evaluating his character, testing his resolve, or measuring the strength of his loyalty. Someone who had plans that extended far beyond the immediate crisis of the Horus heresy. Plans that would reach forward 10,000 years into the future. Malcador the Sigillite had need of a weapon, and he had just found the perfect blade. Malcador the Sigillite was perhaps the most enigmatic figure in the entire history of the Imperium, second only to the Emperor himself. He was old, impossibly old, a psyker of immense power, who claimed to be a surviving member of an ancient order called the Sigillites, dedicated to preserving humanity's greatest artifacts and knowledge through the long nightmare of the Age of Strife. His true origins remain a mystery even now, shrouded in deliberate obfuscation and the weight of millennia. What is known is that he served the Emperor as no other being has served before or since, as advisor, administrator, regent, confidant, and, in the end, as sacrifice. When the Emperor first learned of Horus's betrayal, his response was not merely military. The master of mankind understood something that even his most brilliant generals and strategists could not fully grasp. The Horus heresy was not simply a civil war. It was a manifestation of something far deeper and far more dangerous. The ruinous powers of chaos, the dark gods that dwelt in the warp, had found a way to strike at the Imperium through the very champions that the Emperor had created to protect it. And if humanity was to survive not just this crisis, but the eternal war against chaos that would follow, new weapons would need to be forged. The Emperor tasked Malcador with creating those weapons. Two initiatives were set in motion simultaneously. The first would become the Inquisition, an organization of mortal investigators and judges with the authority to root out treachery and heresy wherever they took hold. The second would become the Grey Knights, a chapter of Space Marines specifically designed and trained to fight the demonic entities of the warp. But these institutions could not be built overnight, and the Horus heresy was escalating by the day. Malcador needed agents, warriors who could operate independently across the galaxy, carrying out missions that were too sensitive for conventional military forces, recruiting individuals whose unique qualities made them essential to the Sigillites' long-term plans. He needed a leader for these agents, and he had been watching Nathaniel Garro for a very long time. After the Eisenstein survivors arrived on Terra and were processed through the various bureaucratic and security procedures that such unprecedented circumstances required, Garro found himself in an uncertain position. He was a captain without a legion, a warrior whose entire chain of command had turned traitor. The Death Guard as he had known them were gone. The Brotherhood he had served for decades had chosen damnation. He was a man without a home, without a purpose, without a place in the hierarchy that defined every aspect of a Space Marine's existence. And then Malcador called for him. The Sigillite met with Garro privately, in the shadow of the Imperial Palace, and laid before him a proposition that would change the course of his life forever. As Malcador spoke of the greater war, the war behind the war, the silent conflict that was being waged not on battlefields but in the shadows, where loyalty and corruption clashed in ways that bolter rounds and chain swords could not address. He spoke of the need for warriors who stood above the petty divisions of legion and chapter, whose loyalty was not to any primarch, but to the emperor himself, and to the survival of the human species. Malcador offered Garro his personal sigil, a symbol that would later become the mark of the Inquisition itself. Under this seal, Garro would operate with an authority that transcended conventional military rank. He would answer to no primarch, no general, no official in the imperial bureaucracy. He would answer only to Malcador, and through him, to the emperor. His title would be Agentia Primus. His mission would be to find others like himself. Malcador gave Garro a list, not a long one, but each name on it represented a warrior of exceptional quality, a space marine whose loyalty, skill, and character made them suitable for a purpose that Malcador would not yet fully reveal. Some of these warriors served in loyalist legions, where their recruitment would be a matter of negotiation and diplomacy. Others served in traitor legions, having somehow retained their loyalty to the emperor despite the corruption that had consumed their brothers. Finding them would be dangerous. Recruiting them would be harder still, and the purpose behind their gathering would remain hidden until the very end, when the pieces of Malcador's grand design would finally fall into place and the true shape of his plan would be revealed. Garro accepted the mission without hesitation, not because he understood its full scope, not because he saw the grand design that Malcador was weaving across the canvas of galactic history. He accepted because it was the right thing to do, because the Emperor's servants were needed, and he was an Emperor's servant above all else. Because an Albion kept his word and held his ground, and if the ground had shifted beneath him, if the legion he had served was gone, and the certainties he had built his life upon had crumbled to dust, then he would find new ground to hold. He put aside his Death Guard heraldry. The old colours, the faded white and green of a legion that had died at Istvan, were replaced by unadorned slate-grey ceramite, the colour of bare metal, the colour of a blade stripped of ornament and reduced to its essential purpose. Where the skull and star of the Death Guard had once marked his shoulder, now only the sigil of the sigillite remained, acid etched into the ceramite and tattooed on the flesh beneath. Nathaniel Garro, battle captain of the Death Guard's 7th Great Company, was no more. In his place stood the first knight-errant, a weapon in the Emperor's hand, a ghost in grey armour who moved between the cracks of a galaxy at war, serving a purpose that almost no one else understood. He drew his power sword, the ancient blade called Libertas, and swore an oath upon it, an oath of moment, binding himself to the sigillite's service until death or completion of his mission. And then he went to work. The years of the Horus Heresy were the darkest period in human history. Across the galaxy, loyalist and traitor forces clashed in battles of staggering scale and ferocity, the fabric of the Imperium tearing apart as legion fought legion, and world after world burned in the fires of civil war. Against this backdrop of apocalyptic conflict, Nathaniel Garro moved like a shadow, crisscrossing the galaxy on missions that took him from the burned-out ruins of the Istvan system to the halls of power on Terra itself. His first and most important task was recruitment. Malcador had provided him with names, but turning those names into actual knights-errant was a process that required persistence, persuasion, and occasionally force. Each potential recruit was a unique case, a warrior with his own loyalties, his own doubts, his own reasons for fighting or refusing to fight. One of his earliest and most significant recruits was Tylos Rubio, a former librarian of the Ultramarines Legion. Rubio was a psyker, one of the Space Marine librarians who had been forced to suppress their powers following the Council of Nicaea, where the Emperor had ruled that the use of psychic abilities by Space Marines was too dangerous to be permitted. Rubio had obeyed that edict faithfully, even as the horrors of the heresy demonstrated beyond any doubt that psychic powers were essential weapons in the fight against chaos. Garro found Rubio in the aftermath of a terrible battle, and his recruitment was not without complications. Rubio was reluctant to break his oath to suppress his powers, viewing the Emperor's edict as binding regardless of circumstances. But Garro argued, with the simple, straightforward logic that was his hallmark, that the circumstances had changed. The emperor had made the ruling at Nicaea based on certain assumptions about the nature of the threat facing humanity. Those assumptions had been proven catastrophically wrong. The enemies they now faced, demons and sorcerers and beings of pure warp energy, could not be defeated by bolters and blades alone. Psychic power was not a luxury, it was a necessity. Rubio accepted, and in doing so, became one of the key figures in the Grey Knight's eventual founding. His psychic abilities, honed during decades of service in the Ultramarines, and then sharpened further during the Heresy, would make him one of the most formidable warriors in the Knights Errant. Another critical recruit was Mesa Varan, as a captain of the World Eaters who had escaped the Istvan system by a different route than Garro. Varan was a warrior of extraordinary personal courage, but he carried the burden of his legion's fall particularly heavily. The World Eaters, under the influence of their tormented Primarch Angron, had descended into a madness of butchery and blood rage that made them almost indistinguishable from the daemons they had inadvertently come to serve. Varan had resisted this descent, but the cost of that resistance was immense. He was a man at war with his own gene seed, fighting against the implanted aggression that the butcher's nails, those crude neural implants that Angron had forced upon his legion, constantly drove him toward. Garro recruited Varan with the understanding that the knight-errant would serve not as a berserker unleashed upon the enemy, but as a disciplined warrior channeling his fury through purpose and conviction. It was a redemption of sorts, a chance for Varan to prove that the World Eater's fall was not inevitable, that a warrior could resist the corruption of his own heritage through the strength of his will. The list grew longer as the years passed. Garro traveled to Calth, where the Ultramarines had been ambushed by the Word-Bearers in one of the most devastating surprise attacks of the Heresy, and he navigated through the warp storms of the Ruin Storm to reach warriors stranded on the far side of the galaxy. He infiltrated the Phalanx, the fortress monastery of the Imperial Fists, as in an attempt to recruit some of the librarians who had been confined there following the Edict of Nicaea, though this particular mission met with failure when the librarians declined to leave their self-imposed exile. He even faced a custodian guard in single combat, one of the Emperor's personal bodyguards, warriors who were individually superior to even the most skilled Space Marine. The duel was close and exhausting, and Garro won only by exploiting the particular individual's overconfidence. It was a testament to his extraordinary skill, because defeating a Custodes in any form of combat was a feat that very few Astartes in the entire Imperium could claim. But perhaps his most poignant mission was his return to Istvan III, the world where the betrayal had begun. Garro went back to that dead, a virus-scarred planet to find one last warrior, Garviel Loken, the former captain of the Lunar Wolves, who had been on the surface when the virus bombs fell and had somehow survived. Loken had been driven nearly mad by his experiences. The slaughter of his brothers, the destruction of everything he had believed in, the long months of guerrilla warfare against overwhelming traitor forces on a planet that was slowly becoming a charnel house. All of it had pushed the once noble warrior to the very edge of sanity. When Garro found him, Loken was barely recognizable as the composed, thoughtful officer he had once been. He was a haunted, half-feral creature, living in the ruins and fighting shadows both real and imagined. But Garro, with the patient determination that was his defining characteristic, reached through the madness and found the man beneath. He reminded Loken of who he had been, of what he had fought for, of the duty that still remained, even when everything else was gone. And slowly, painfully, Garviel Loken returned to himself. It was an act of mercy as much as recruitment. Garro gave Loken something that the horrors of Istvan had stripped away from him: purpose. A reason to keep fighting when the darkness seemed absolute and endless. And in return, Loken gave the Knights Errant something that no other warrior could provide: the perspective of a man who had looked into the very heart of the heresy's horror and refused to be consumed by it. These were the Knights Errant, warriors drawn from across the legions, from loyalist and traitor alike, united not by shared gene seed or shared heritage, but by shared conviction. They were the Emperor's hidden blade, Malcador's secret weapon, a force that operated beyond the conventional command structures of the Imperium and answered to a purpose that even they did not fully understand. And at their head, always, was Nathaniel Garro, the Agentia Primus, the first among equals, the Albion who held the line when everything around him was falling apart. Not all of Garro's missions during this period were related to recruitment. As the leader of the Knights Errant, he was frequently called upon to investigate threats, neutralize dangers, and carry out operations that could not be entrusted to conventional military forces. Some of these missions were straightforward. Others tested even Garro's formidable resolve. On Nolek Trimus, he faced a dragon-like daemon that fed on blood, and a creature of the warp made manifest in the material world. The beast was cunning, refusing to fully commit to combat until it sensed enough prey to make the risk worthwhile. Garro used this against it, waiting until reinforcements arrived and then luring the demon into a trap where it could be destroyed. Among those reinforcements was Helig Galor, a former Death Guard like Garro himself, another loyalist who had refused to follow his legion into damnation. On Terra itself, Garro and his Knights Errant fought against chaos cultist cells that had infiltrated the throne world, rooting out sedition and demonic incursions that threatened the Imperial Palace's defenses from within. These were the battles of the Silent War, the unseen conflict that raged in parallel with the great military campaigns of the heresy. While legions clashed on distant battlefields, the Knights Errant fought in the shadows, in the underhives and the secret vaults, and the forgotten corridors of a civilization that was tearing itself apart. And through it all, Garro was also engaged in a personal quest that would intersect with his official duties in unexpected ways. He was searching for Euphrati Keela, the young woman whose faith had saved the Eisenstein from the horrors of the warp. After their arrival on Terra, Keela had been taken into the custody of the Sisters of Silence, who believed her supernatural abilities marked her as a renegade psyker. But Keela had escaped and gone to ground somewhere on the vast surface of Terra, continuing to preach the divinity of the Emperor to anyone who would listen. Garro needed to find her, not just because Malcador had expressed an interest in Keela's abilities, though that was certainly a factor, but because Garro himself was struggling with questions that no amount of military discipline could answer. His faith in the Emperor had been shaken and then rebuilt by his experiences aboard the Eisenstein, but the nature of that faith was uncertain. The imperial truth, the secular philosophy that the Emperor had promoted throughout the Great Crusade, explicitly denied the existence of gods and the supernatural. Yet Garro had seen things that defied that denial. He had seen Keela banish demons with nothing but her belief. He had felt the Emperor's power flowing through the young woman like light through a prism. Was the Emperor a god? Was faith a weapon? Or was it a trap, a door that once opened could never be closed again? These questions haunted Garro as he carried out his duties, adding a layer of philosophical weight to a mission that was already crushing in its demands. He was not simply fighting a war. He was wrestling with the fundamental nature of reality, with the relationship between faith and power, with the meaning of his own existence in a universe that had proven to be far stranger and more dangerous than anyone had imagined. His search for Keela eventually succeeded, but not before crossing paths with another of Horus's plots. The War Master had sent assassins to Terra to kill Keela, recognizing that the growing cult around the living saint posed a threat to his plans. The assassination attempt was foiled by Garro's timely intervention, and Keela was subsequently placed under Malcador's protection, her abilities studied, and where possible, utilized as weapons against the forces of chaos. The reunion between Garro and Keela was a complex moment, layered with unspoken emotion and spiritual significance. Keela had changed since the Eisenstein. Her faith had deepened and broadened, transforming her from a simple believer into something approaching a prophet. She could share visions of the future, heal wounds through the power of prayer, and project an aura of calm certainty that could steady the nerves of battle-hardened warriors in the midst of the worst fighting. And Garro had changed too. The steady, reliable battle captain who had boarded the Eisenstein was still there, but he was now carrying the weight of years of covert warfare, of compromises and sacrifices and decisions that would have broken lesser men. His faith in the Emperor had become something more complex than simple loyalty. It was a conviction that went beyond duty, beyond honor, beyond even the rational analysis that Space Marines were trained to apply to every situation. It was a belief that burned in the core of his being, an anchor in the storm of the heresy that kept him grounded when everything else was being swept away. Keela recognized this in him. She told him, in the quiet moments between crises, that he was already what Malcador needed him to be. A warrior of faith, a knight, not just in title, but in spirit. A champion of something greater than any legion or any Primarch. Garro was not entirely sure he believed her, but he filed the thought away in the corner of his mind where he kept the things he could not yet process, but refused to forget. The war ground on. Years passed, measured not in seasons or harvests, but in battles fought, and brothers lost, and worlds consumed by the advancing shadow of Horus's rebellion. The knights-errant continued their work, their numbers growing as Garro and his agents recruited more warriors to the Sigillites' cause. And behind the scenes, Malcador's grand design was slowly taking shape, its ultimate purpose still hidden from all but the Sigillite himself. But the time was coming when the hidden purpose would be revealed, when the pieces would come together and the true shape of Malcador's plan would emerge from the shadows. And when that moment arrived, Nathaniel Garro would face a choice that would define not just his own fate, but the fate of every warrior who would ever bear the sigil of the Grey Knights. And there is a particular kind of courage that does not involve facing an enemy in battle. It is the courage to question what you have been told, to hold a belief that contradicts everything your training, your culture, and your authority figures insist is true. To look at the evidence of your own experience and trust it over the official doctrine that has been drilled into you since the moment of your creation. Nathaniel Garro possessed this courage in abundance, and nowhere was it more severely tested than in his relationship with faith. The imperial truth, the philosophy that underpinned the entire Great Crusade, was explicit in its denial of the supernatural. There were no gods. There was no divine power. The universe was governed by rational, comprehensible laws, and the strange phenomena associated with the warp were merely natural forces that could be understood and controlled through science and reason. This was not simply a philosophical position. It was imperial policy, enforced with the same authority as any military order. To suggest that the emperor was a god, to worship him as a divine being, was heresy of the highest order, a violation of the very principles that the Great Crusade had been launched to promote. And yet Garro had seen things that the imperial truth could not explain. He had seen Euphrati Keela banish demons with the power of her faith. He had felt the Emperor's presence reaching through the warp to protect the Eisenstein from forces that should have destroyed it. He had witnessed miracles, actual undeniable miracles, performed by a woman whose only weapon was her belief in the Emperor's divinity. These experiences did not make Garro a simple-minded fanatic. He was too Albion for that, too grounded in the practical, hard-headed pragmatism that was the heritage of his homeland. But they planted seeds of belief that grew steadily through the long years of the heresy, fed by the things he saw and the experiences he accumulated as a knight-errant. By the time of the Siege of Terror, Garro's faith had become one of the defining features of his character, a source of strength that complemented and sometimes transcended his considerable martial abilities. This faith would prove to be more than personal comfort in the final days of the war. Keela, for her part, had become something that the secular Imperium had no framework to understand. And she was the first living saint, a mortal woman whose connection to the Emperor's psychic power allowed her to perform feats that defied rational explanation. She could heal the wounded. She could project visions of the future. She could inspire those around her with a certainty that cut through fear and doubt like a blade through cloth. She was, in every meaningful sense of the word, a conduit for the Emperor's will, a living instrument through which the divine power of the master of mankind could be expressed in the material world. Garro's relationship with Keela was complex and layered. On one level, he was her protector, tasked by Malcador with keeping the living saints safe from the innumerable forces that wanted her dead. On another level, she was his spiritual guide, the person who helped him navigate the treacherous waters of faith in a universe that had been specifically designed to deny the very concept. And on a deeper level still, there was a connection between them that went beyond duty or doctrine, a mutual recognition of kindred spirits who had both been transformed by their encounter with the divine. He would visit her when his duties permitted, seeking counsel in the quiet spaces between missions. She was held for a time in a Blackstone prison beneath the Tower of Hegemon on Terra, not as punishment, but as protection, her faith and her growing powers making her both an invaluable asset and a potential liability in the delicate political landscape of a throne world preparing for siege. Garro would come to her there, the knight in grey armor and the saint in her simple robes, and they would speak of things that Space Marines were not supposed to think about. The meaning of suffering, the nature of sacrifice, the possibility that the Emperor was something more than the greatest man who had ever lived. The hope that the darkness consuming the galaxy was not permanent, not absolute, not beyond the power of faith and courage to overcome. These conversations sustained Garro through the bleakest moments of the war. When the news reached Terra that world after world had fallen to the traitors, when reports came in of atrocities that would have seemed impossible before the heresy began, when the slow, grinding reality of a civil war between transhuman warriors stripped away the illusions of glory and left only the raw, ugly truth of brother killing brother across 1,000,000 battlefields. Keela told Garro, during one of their meetings, that his path was not yet complete, that the Emperor had a purpose for him that extended beyond the knights errant, beyond the immediate crisis of the heresy, beyond anything he could currently imagine. She spoke of this with the calm certainty that characterized all her pronouncements, the absolute conviction of a woman who had looked into the heart of something divine and emerged with knowledge that transcended mortal understanding. Garro listened. He did not fully understand, but he filed it away, as he always did, in that part of his mind reserved for truths that were too large to be grasped all at once. As the Horus heresy ground toward its bloody conclusion, the moment came that Malcador had been planning for since the very beginning. At the moment when the true purpose of the Knights Errant would finally be revealed, and the next phase of the Sigillites' grand design would be set in motion. The Buried Dagger, as later histories would call this period, was a time of endings and beginnings. The Death Guard, Garro's former legion, was lost in the warp, trapped in the Imperium by the machinations of First Captain Callus Typhon, and consumed by a plague of Nurgle's devising that broke even their legendary resilience. Mortarion, in desperation, offered himself and his entire legion to the Plague God in exchange for deliverance from the disease that was destroying them. The Death Guard emerged from the warp as Plague Marines, twisted and corrupted beyond recognition, their once proud heraldry replaced by the dripping, putrid iconography of Nurgle's Chosen. On Terra, Malcador and his Knights Errant were fighting their own battles. Chaos cultists had infiltrated the throne world, spreading sedition and summoning demonic entities in advance of Horus's approaching fleet. The Knights Errant rooted out these threats with their customary efficiency, but the scale of the infiltration was staggering. The forces of chaos were reaching for Terra with 1,000 invisible hands, and the defenders were stretched thin, trying to contain them all. During this period, Garro and his fellow Knights Errant fought a particularly brutal engagement against a chaos incursion at the White Mountain military installation. The enemy was led by a Nurglish demon called the Lord of Flies, a creature that had a personal connection to Garro's past, as it was, in fact, the possessed remnant of Solendetius, and one of Garro's own former battle brothers from the Death Guard, who had been corrupted during the flight of the Eisenstein. The battle was costly. Mesa Varin, the former World Eater who had served faithfully as a knight-errant for years, was killed in the fighting. His death a grim reminder that even the strongest warriors could fall. And then Malcador revealed his plan. The Sigillite gathered his most trusted agents, the warriors he had been carefully selecting and testing throughout the entire heresy, and told them what he had been building toward all along. The Emperor had recognized that the legions Astartes, his original Space Marine legions, had been designed to fight threats in the physical realm. They had never been intended to combat the horrors of the warp, the demons and sorceries that chaos could unleash against humanity. This was a critical oversight, one that the heresy had exposed with devastating clarity. A new force was needed, a chapter of Space Marines specifically created to fight the demonic. Warriors who were not merely resistant to the corruption of chaos, but actively anathema to it. Psychers of extraordinary power, trained and equipped to do battle with the very worst that the warp could produce. The Grey Knights. Malcador selected 8 Space Marines from among the Knights Errant to become the founders of this new chapter, the first Grand Masters who would lead the Grey Knights in their eternal war against the forces of chaos. These 8 were all Psychers, as warriors whose paranormal abilities had been kept dormant since the Council of Nicaea's edict against the use of psychic powers, but which were now recognized as essential weapons in the battle ahead. Their identities were made secret, their original names replaced with new designations drawn from the mythology of ancient Terra's titans. Janus, who was in truth an extraordinary fusion of a Thousand Suns warrior, named Revuel Arvida, and a psychic fragment of the Primarch Magnus the Red, transformed by Malcador's arcane arts into a new being altogether. Koios, who had been Tylos Rubio of the Ultramarines, the first librarian that Garro had recruited. Epimetheus of the Dark Angels. Chiron, believed to have been Feljarost of the Night Lords. Satre of the Blood Angels. Iapto, the former Lunar Wolf Severian. And others whose original identities were carefully concealed even from the records of the Grey Knights themselves. 8 warriors, 8 founders, 8 pillars upon which an entire institution would be built. But Nathaniel Garro was not among them. This is one of the most significant and debated aspects of Garro's story, and it deserves careful attention. Garro had been the leader of the Knights Errant, the Agentia Primus, the warrior who had personally recruited many of the individuals who would go on to found the Grey Knights. He had served Malcador with unwavering loyalty through years of the most dangerous and demanding service imaginable. And yet, when the moment came to select the 8 founders of the new chapter, Malcador did not choose him. The reason, according to the accounts that survive, was not a lack of faith in Garro's abilities or his loyalty. It was something more specific. Malcador stated that Garro's fate was not tied to Titan, the moon of Saturn, where the Grey Knights' fortress monastery was being constructed. Garro's destiny, the Sigillite said, was tied to Terra, to the battle that was coming, to a confrontation that only Garro could face. With that, Malcador released Garro from his oath of service. The Agentia Primus was set free, absolved of his duties as a knight errant. He was, for the first time since the flight of the Eisenstein, a warrior without a formal assignment, without a chain of command, without a prescribed purpose. And what did Garro do with this freedom? He chose to fight. Along with Helig Galor and Garviel Loken, Garro declared that they would stand on Terra's walls when Horus came. They would defend the Emperor's palace with their lives. They would meet the traitors face to face, blade to blade, and they would not yield. Malcador took his 8 chosen warriors to Titan through a hidden webway portal beneath the Imperial Palace. On Titan, they found a fortress monastery already prepared, stocked with gene seed derived from the Emperor's own genome, and populated with hundreds of thousands of carefully selected recruits who possessed both psychic potential and unbreakable willpower. Malcador appointed Janus as the first Supreme Grand Master of the Grey Knights, tasked him with building a chapter that could stand against the horrors of the warp for eternity, and then performed his greatest feat of psychic power. He hid Titan in the warp itself, wrapping Saturn's largest moon in a bubble of real space maintained by massive Geller field generators and his own immense psychic abilities. Malkador sent Titan into the Imperium, where it would ride out the final battle for Terra in safety. When it returned, years would have passed in real space, but centuries would have elapsed on Titan, time enough for the 8 founders and their recruits to grow into a full chapter of 1,000 battle-ready Grey Knights. It was an act of almost incomprehensible foresight and sacrifice. Malkador was not just creating a military unit. He was creating a legacy, an institution that would endure for 10,000 years and beyond, fighting a war that most of the Imperium would never even know existed. His work on Titan complete, Malkador returned to Terra. He had one final duty to perform, one last sacrifice to make. When the Emperor was mortally wounded in his final confrontation with Horus aboard the Vengeful Spirit, it was Malkador who held the Golden Throne in his absence, sustaining the psychic beacon of the Astronomicon with his own life force, until the Emperor could be returned and interred upon it. Malkador the Sigillite died on the floor of the throne room, his body crumbling to dust as the last reserves of his immense psychic power were finally exhausted. He had given everything, his strength, his knowledge, his very life, all in service to a vision that extended far beyond the immediate crisis, a vision of humanity's survival that encompassed not just the present, but all the millennia that would follow. But before all of that, before the final battle, before the death of the Sigillite and the entombment of the Emperor, there was the siege of Terra, and there was Nathaniel Garro's last fight. The siege of Terra was the climax of the Horus heresy, the final, cataclysmic battle that would determine the fate of humanity for the next 10,000 years. Horus brought his entire traitor fleet to the Sol system, surrounding Terra with a force of such overwhelming power that the defenders could only watch as world after world in the system fell before the advancing tide of corruption. When the siege began in earnest, Garro was at the walls, not commanding from a strategic remove, not coordinating operations from a bunker deep beneath the palace. He was on the front lines, fighting with the desperate fury of a man who understood that this was the end. Win or lose, live or die, the galaxy would never be the same after this battle. He fought alongside Garviel Loken, leading kill squads in ambush operations beneath the Saturnine Gate, one of the primary entry points into the Imperial Palace that the traitors were attempting to breach. The fighting in the tunnels and passages beneath the gate was some of the most intense of the entire siege. Close-quartered combat between space marines who had once been brothers, now separated by an ideological chasm that no bridge could span. During these engagements, Garro and his team encountered Falcus Kibra, a former captain of Horus's personal elite force, the Josterin Terminators. Kibra had been a formidable warrior even before his corruption, and the powers of chaos had made him something far worse. But Garro fought with a ferocity that surprised even himself, in cutting through the Josterin with Libertas, until he stood over the fallen body of Kibra himself. Looking down at the traitor, Garro saw not just an enemy, but a victim, a warrior whose soul had been consumed by the demonic entity that now inhabited his corrupted flesh. He felt pity for what Kibra had become, even as he ended the creature's existence. They also confronted Ezekiel Abaddon, the first captain of the Sons of Horus, and the warrior who would eventually become the most feared Chaos warlord in the galaxy. Garro and his fellow loyalist commanders managed to ambush Abaddon, and in the fierce battle that followed, the traitor was pinned beneath the body of a fallen loyalist world eater who had fought with unrelenting ferocity. Garro moved in for the killing blow. Libertas raised for a strike that could have ended the threat of Abaddon the Despoiler 10,000 years before he earned that dreadful title. But Abaddon was teleported away at the last moment, snatched from death by technology or sorcery, his survival ensuring that the Imperium would face his wrath for millennia to come. It is one of the great what-ifs of Imperial history. If Garro's blade had fallen a heartbeat sooner, if the teleport had been a fraction of a second slower, How different might the 41st millennium have been? But the siege was not yet done with Nathaniel Garro. There was one more confrontation waiting for him, the one that Malcador had foreseen, the one that Keeler had prophesied, at the one that had been building since the moment a young boy from Old Albia had been inducted into the 14th Legion and sworn his loyalty to a Primarch who would eventually betray everything he believed in. Mortarion had come to terror. The Death Lord, now a demon Primarch of Nurgle, bloated and corrupted beyond recognition, led his Plague Marines against the Imperial Palace with the relentless, grinding determination that had once been the Death Guard's greatest virtue and was now their most terrible weapon. Where they walked, disease spread like wildfire. Where they fought, the very ground beneath their feet rotted and decayed, stones crumbling to dust and metal rusting to nothing in the presence of Nurgle's chosen. Garro found Mortarion at Marmak's Bastion, one of the Imperial Palace's outer defensive positions. He had gone there to rendezvous with Euphrati Keeler and Helig Gallo, but the Death Guard struck before they could withdraw. Mortarion and Typhus, the former Callus Typhon now transformed into the Herald of Nurgle, led the assault personally. Garro knew what he had to do. He told Gallo to take Keeler and run, to get the living saint to safety no matter what happened, and then he stepped forward, alone, to face his Gene father. The confrontation between Garro and Mortarion was more than a battle. It was a conversation, a reckoning between a father and a son, between a Primarch who had chosen damnation and the warrior who had refused to follow him into the dark. Mortarion did not immediately attack. Instead, he offered Garro a cup. One of the traditional cups of vengeance, is the poisoned drinks that the Death Guard had shared as a ritual of brotherhood for as long as the Legion had existed. It was a gesture loaded with meaning, a callback to the old times, to the days before the heresy, when a Primarch might honor a favored officer with this simple, brutal ceremony. Garro took the cup. He held it in his hands and looked at the dark liquid within. And for a moment, a terrible, aching moment, he allowed himself to feel the grief that he had been carrying since Istvan. The grief for his legion, for his brothers, for the warrior traditions of the Death Guard that had shaped him and defined him and given him purpose, for the bond between Primarch and Jane Son that had been perverted into something monstrous. He looked into the cup and saw everything he had lost reflected in that dark, poisoned surface. And then he put it down. He refused. The duel that followed was brutal and, by any rational assessment, hopeless. Garro was a space marine, one of the finest warriors the Emperor had ever created, but he was still mortal. Mortarion was a demon Primarch, empowered by the full might of a chaos god, a being whose strength and resilience transcended anything that the material universe could naturally produce. The power gap between them was enormous, almost insurmountable. But Garro did not fight with the cold calculation of a warrior assessing his odds. He fought with something else, something that burned brighter than tactical analysis, something that could not be measured in power levels or combat statistics. He fought with faith. The duel raged through the ruins of Marmak's Bastion. If the two warriors trading blows that shattered stonework and split ceramite, Mortarion held back at first, toying with his former captain, intending to humiliate Garro before ending him. He underestimated the strength that faith can grant to those who carry it. Garro saw an opening, a gap in the Primarch's guard, born of overconfidence and contempt, and he struck. Libertas, the power sword that had been his companion since the days of the Dusk Raiders, bit deep into Mortarion's cheek, drawing a line of black-green ichor across the Daemon Primarch's corrupted flesh. Mortarion roared. The mockery was over. The Primarch struck back with the full force of his demonic power, and Garro was hurled into the debris like a toy discarded by a petulant child. The blow would have killed any lesser warrior instantly. Garro survived, but barely. His body broken, his armor cracked, his consciousness fading. And then Mortarion did something that went beyond simple murder. He summoned the power of Nurgle, calling forth a swarm of flies, a demonic manifestation intended to consume Garro's dying body, and turn it into a puppet of the plague god. The Lord of Flies, that same entity that had been born from the corruption of Garro's former battle brother, Solon Decius, would take up residence in Garro's flesh, transforming the loyal warrior into a vessel of the very corruption he had spent his entire life fighting against. It was the cruelest fate imaginable. Not just death, but the desecration of everything Garro stood for. His body turned into a weapon of chaos, his name made a mockery, his loyalty perverted into servitude. But where Garro should have died, a miracle intervened. Euphrates Keeler, the living saint, who should have been safely away from the battle by now, returned. She projected the Emperor's light into the battlefield, a burst of psychic energy channeled through the lens of her absolute faith that burned through the gathering corruption like sunlight through morning fog. The flies recoiled, the demonic presence was pushed back, and Garro, empowered by the same light that had saved the Eisenstein so many years ago, rose to his feet one final time. He fought again. Not to win, because winning was impossible, but to buy time. To hold the line one last time so that Keeler could escape, so that the things worth protecting could be carried forward into whatever future awaited beyond the horror of this war. Mortarion struck him down again, this time with a finality that could not be denied. The demon Primarch's power was simply too great, the disparity between them too vast to be bridged even by faith and courage, and the stubborn, indomitable will of an Albion warrior who refused to kneel. Nathaniel Garro died on Terra's soil. He died fighting the creature that his Primarch had become. He died with Libertas in his hand and the Emperor's name on his lips. He died, as the former iterator, Kirill Sinderman, would later describe him, as the first true martyr of the Imperial cult. The legacy of Nathaniel Garro extends far beyond the story of one warrior's life and death, as profound as that story is. To understand the full measure of what he accomplished, you have to look not at what happened to him, but at what happened because of him. The ripples of his choices spread outward across the millennia, is touching everything they encountered and shaping the Imperium in ways that Garro himself could never have imagined. Start with the most immediate consequence: the flight of the Eisenstein. Without Garro's decision to commandeer that battered frigate and carry the warning of Horus's betrayal to Terra, the traitor legions would have achieved complete strategic surprise. The loyalist forces would have been caught entirely unprepared, their defenses unorganized, their response fragmented and chaotic. It is entirely possible that Horus would have marched on Terra virtually unopposed, and the siege that ultimately cost him victory would never have happened. Every defensive preparation that the loyalists made, every fortification that Rogel Dawn constructed, every military deployment that was organized to meet the traitor advance, all of it was possible because one warrior chose to run when every instinct told him to fight, carrying a message that saved an empire. Then consider the Knights Errant. Garro was not simply their leader, he was their creator, the individual who gave shape and purpose to an organization that had previously existed only as a concept in Malcador's mind. Without Garro's tireless recruitment efforts, without his ability to identify and persuade warriors of exceptional quality from across the fractured remnants of 18 Space Marine legions, the raw material for the Grey Knights would never have been assembled. Every warrior he recruited carried a piece of his example with them, and every knight errant who stripped away the colors of a fallen legion and donned the unmarked grey of the Sigillite service was following a path that Garro had blazed. He proved that loyalty to the Emperor transcended legion, transcended gene seed, transcended even the bond between Primarch and Geneson. He showed that a Space Marine could be more than the product of his heritage, that the values a warrior chose to embody were more important than the genetic template he was built upon. And then there are the Grey Knights themselves. When Titan returned to real space after the end of the heresy, time had passed differently in the warp. Centuries had elapsed on the hidden moon, while only years had passed in the material universe. The 8 founders and their recruits had grown into a full chapter of 1,000 battle brothers. Each one a trained psyker, each one armored in silver-grey ceramite, each one carrying the Emperor's gene seed in his blood and the Emperor's will in his heart. They were designated Chapter 666, slipped into the records of the second founding with a secrecy that ensured most of the Imperium would never know they existed. Their purpose was known only to the Inquisition and the highest levels of imperial authority. They were the ultimate weapon against the demonic, warriors who could walk into the full fury of a chaos incursion and emerge victorious, where any other force would be corrupted or destroyed. 10,000 years later, the Grey Knights continue to serve that purpose. They are the Emperor's silver blade, the secret fire that burns in the darkness of the warp. They fight battles that no one else can fight, and against enemies that no one else can face. They pay a price for this service that no other chapter can comprehend. Every engagement a test of their psychic fortitude, every victory achieved at the cost of brothers lost to the very powers they exist to combat. And all of it, every silver-armored warrior, every demon banished, every world saved from the all-consuming horror of chaos, all of it traces back to a decision made by a single warrior on a single frigate in the darkness above Istvan III. Garro did not become a Grey Knight. That was never his destiny. His destiny was something different, something that Malcador understood even when Garro himself did not. He was the catalyst, the seed from which the entire tree grew, as the single point of origin from which a 10,000-year legacy of sacrifice and vigilance and unwavering courage emerged. The title, Knight of Grey, was given to him not because he wore the silver armor or carried the Grey Knight's distinctive weaponry. It was given to him because he embodied the spirit that the Grey Knights were built upon, the willingness to stand against impossible odds, the refusal to be corrupted, even when corruption was the easy path, the absolute, unshakable conviction that humanity was worth fighting for, worth dying for, worth sacrificing everything to protect. In the grim darkness of the far future, 10,000 years after Garro's death, the Grey Knights still carry echoes of his example. They strip away their identities when they join the chapter, taking new names and new purposes. Just as Garro stripped away his Death Guard heraldry when he became a knight-errant. They fight in the shadows, unknown and unremembered by the people they protect, just as Garro fought his silent war in the years between the Eisenstein and the siege. They carry the sigil of Malcador on their armor, the same symbol that Garro was the first to bear. And somewhere, in the deepest vaults of the Citadel of Titan, sealed behind doors that only the highest-ranking members of the chapter can open, there may still exist records of the man who started it all. The battle captain from old Albia, who chose loyalty when loyalty meant losing everything. The warrior who carried a warning across the stars through the very gates of damnation. The leader who gathered the scattered faithful and forged them into a weapon that would endure for eternity. Yes, Nathaniel Garro, the Knight of Grey, the first and the greatest of his kind. His fate remains a matter of deliberate mystery in the current lore. Some accounts say he died at Mortarian's hand during the Siege of Terra, as I have described. Others suggest he survived and was imprisoned with the survivors of the Eisenstein, never to be released. There are whispers that he lives still, commanding a secret force clad in the old colors of the pre-heresy Death Guard, fighting an eternal war in the Emperor's name. And there is one darker tradition that claims he fell to the same corruption that claimed his legion, becoming the very Lord of Flies that he fought against, though the evidence strongly suggests that this fate belonged to Solon Decius, not to Garro. The ambiguity is intentional. The Games Workshop and the Black Library authors who crafted Garro's story, particularly James Swallow, who wrote him from the very beginning with The Flight of the Eisenstein, and carried his narrative through numerous audio dramas and novels, all the way to its conclusion in Garro, Knight of Grey, have always treated Garro's ultimate fate with a degree of deliberate uncertainty. And that uncertainty serves the character perfectly, because Garro was always a man defined not by what happened to him, but by what he chose to do. His story is, at its heart, a story about choice. The choice to be loyal when loyalty is costly. The choice to believe when belief is dangerous. The choice to stand when standing is painful. The choice to be human. To be more than the sum of your genetic engineering and your military training and your chain of command. More to hold fast to the values that make you who you are, even when every force in the universe is conspiring to tear them away. And that is why his story matters. Not because of the military victories or the heroic last stands or the galaxy-shaping consequences of his actions, though all of these are significant. His story matters because it demonstrates that in the darkest hour, in the most hopeless circumstances, against the most overwhelming opposition, a single individual's choice to do the right thing can change everything. Nathaniel Garro did not save the Imperium by himself. He did not single-handedly defeat the forces of chaos or prevent the Horus heresy from consuming humanity. But he made the choice that made everything else possible. He held the line when the line was breaking. He carried the light when the darkness was at its deepest. He planted the seed from which the Grey Knights grew, and through them he ensured that humanity would always have a weapon against the things that dwell in the warp. 10,000 years after his death, the enemies of humanity still fear the warriors he helped create. The demons of the warp still recoil from the silver blades and psychic fury of the Grey Knights. The shadow that Garro cast from his brief, brilliant life still falls across the battlefields of the 41st Millennium, offering protection to those who will never know his name. And somewhere in the vast darkness between the stars, in whatever afterlife awaits a warrior who gave everything in service to a cause greater than himself, the spirit of Nathaniel Garro rests, his oath fulfilled, his duty complete, his legacy eternal, the Knight of Grey, the first of his kind, and the best. Thank you so much for listening to this one. I know it was a long one, but Garro's story deserved to be told in full because it connects to so many of the most important events in the entire Warhammer 40K universe. From the betrayal at Istvan to the founding of the Grey Knights, from the flight of the Eisenstein to the siege of Terra, Garro was there at every critical moment, making the choices that shaped the future of humanity for the next 10,000 years. If you enjoyed this deep dive into the lore, please consider hitting that like button. It really does help the channel grow and lets me know that you want more content like this. And if you are not subscribed yet, go ahead and hit that subscribe button so you do not miss the next video. Now, I've got a lot more stories to tell from the grim darkness of the far future, and I promise every one of them will be just as detailed and immersive as this one. Until next time, take care of yourselves. And remember, in the darkness, there is always a light. Sometimes it is carried by a warrior in grey armor, with a sword called Libertas, and a heart that refuses to break. The Emperor protects.
I hope you guys enjoyed the story. Make sure to hit the subscribe, like, share button, whatever you want. Give me some feedback if there's any. And yeah, sleep well.